All right, welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andy Mack. No shortage of news coming out of a jam-packed White House press briefing room as President Donald Trump covered a lot of topics, including his upcoming meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin, scheduled for Friday in Alaska. As he said, he's expected to determine in mere moments into his meeting if it's possible to work out a deal to halt the war in Ukraine. For more on this, let's go out to Connor Hansen to get us up to speed.
I'm going in to speak to Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to be telling him, you got to end this war. You got to end it.
For the first time in almost a decade, Russian President Vladimir Putin will be on U.S. soil. Alaska, a former Russian territory, will be the site of the highly anticipated summit. So far, there are no plans for Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky or other European leaders to join, but they are expected to be in close contact before and after.
We're going to change the lines, the battle lines. Russia's occupied a big portion of Ukraine. They've occupied some very prime territory. We're going to try and get some of that territory back for Ukraine.
Russia currently occupies about 20% of Ukraine and most of its coastline. Zelensky has been resistant to ceding any territory to Putin.
The war must end as soon as possible with a just peace.
A joint statement from the leaders of European countries like the UK, Germany, and France read, quote, "We are convinced that only an approach that combines active diplomacy, support to Ukraine, and pressure on the Russian Federation to end their illegal war can succeed." More than 3 years into the war, the fighting continues, with Russian bombs injuring at least a dozen people in Ukraine over the weekend. President Trump says he is willing to join meetings between Putin and Zelensky if the two leaders want him there. In New York, Connor Hansen, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much for that. A live picture there in Washington, D.C. at the White House as we're continuing on with this coverage, talking about it will take about 2 minutes to understand if there is a deal to be made. That, according to President Trump. Let's be joined right now by the AP's Will Weissert, friend of the program. Will, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Did we get any clarity on what might we entail? What did we learn from Trump today talking about this upcoming meeting?
Well, I think the president talked a lot about how he was really flattered. He felt like Putin reached out to him and sort of helped facilitate this meeting and was also willing to come to Alaska. You know, it's closer to Russia, but it's still U.S. territory. He felt like that was sort of a good omen for how things might go. And he said early on in comments to reporters that he felt like this would be a good meeting, but it also could potentially not go as well, and that you know, he would know within a few minutes, as you mentioned. He said it would be up to 2 minutes. He'd be able to tell sort of how serious Putin was and whether or not he could make a deal. And, you know, he also said that a deal might not be possible, and then he might just sort of end things by saying, okay, well, you're going to continue to fight, and that this meeting's not going to necessarily lead to a major breakthrough. So I think he's, you know, he was pretty optimistic going in, but certainly not willing to concede just yet.
Yeah, he said it was kind of a feel-out sort of meeting, but obviously getting them in the room is a major step forward. Did he mention anything else about Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky being at the table? Because I know from his perspective, he needs to be there. He wants to be there in the moment. It felt like didn't necessarily close the door, but made it less so a chance. Did you read into anything like that?
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, he basically said Putin and I are going to meet, and he didn't definitively say like we're not going to include Zelensky, but what he said was we'll meet. Putin and I will meet, and then potentially Zelensky and Putin will meet, and then maybe all three of us will meet. And you know, as you point out, he didn't sort of close the door completely on a three-way meeting to start. But I do think that there'll be it's more likely we'll see a scenario where you have Trump and Putin meeting and discussing, and then potentially Zelensky being involved. And you know, in the package there you just showed, you know, that's sort of worried European leaders who are afraid that Ukraine and its interest might be sidelined. So they've worked to put together a sort of a virtual meeting that might feature Zelensky, that Trump said he'll participate in on Wednesday. Germany sort of leading that effort. But it's only Monday. We've got a few more days to go. It's still possible that we could work out a situation where there is all three meeting. But I think Trump and Putin meeting one-on-one is probably more likely at this point.
Yeah, it's getting a little bit clearer by the day of what this meeting will look like. And I do want to ask you, because we talked about it yesterday, maybe not the finality that this is a make or break meeting to seal potentially peace in that region. Did they bring up sanctions at all? You mentioned that being still on the table in terms of a negotiation, a leverage tactic for Trump. Did we hear anything about sanctions today?
Yeah, Trump didn't really talk about that in the sort of Q&A session today. In fact, he was asked about a situation where if the meeting goes well and there is some sort of breakthrough, a ceasefire and then a longer peace, could he imagine a situation where trade was normalized between Russia and the United States? And he basically said yes, that he felt like that was a trade market where the American interests could flourish, and the same would go for Russian goods coming here. So it wasn't sort of the same strong language of Russia potentially facing sanctions as we'd had in weeks previously. Now, he did say that he mentioned that he'd been frustrated for the last couple of weeks with Putin. That came up again this time too. So it wasn't all sort of flowers and rainbows and positive sentiments, but there wasn't really a lot of movement on sort of the threat of sanctions if things do not go well on Friday.
Yeah, and he's kind of obviously playing a little bit of the both sides to see if it does go well or potentially bad. So we'll see how it is, and we'll see how it looks, like we talked about yesterday. Let's get into the other big news, Will, as we heard this announcement coming down earlier today. And I do want to put up this. This is a live picture on the ground in Washington, D.C. after President Trump announced that the takeover of the police, saying they will deploy the National Guard to Washington, D.C., placing the police department under federal control. And you can see some people obviously upset with that right now on the ground. Does President Trump have the legal grounds to actually do this? And what's the reaction, the initial reaction from our nation's capital?
The feeling is that he does. Washington is different in other cities in that, it was a federal district for a long time and only went to sort of, home rule like a regular city in 1979. And the president does retain, some legal authority to take over in emergency situations for up to 30 days. That seems to be the authority that the president is invoking for this move. The reaction so far, there's been sort of small scale demonstrations. There were a couple outside the White House this afternoon. You saw some video of that just now. The mayor said that she felt like this was unnecessary and unprecedented, and city officials have sort of pointed to violent crime, especially being relatively low and actually falling in recent years. It's for saying there's really no sort of justification for this. But the president was saying that he had seen from his motorcade, not just he called out sort of homeless encampments, but he also talked about graffiti, he talked about litter on the streets. And really saying that he felt like the city wasn't sort of the beautiful place that he wanted world leaders to see when they came to visit. That's a little interesting because he doesn't travel that much in the city by himself. He when he flies out of the city, he flies via helicopter to his presidential airplane in Maryland. He does occasionally go to things like the Kennedy Center where he might see some stuff from motorcade, but just as it kind of whizzes past. So I know this is a topic he's talked about a lot, for several years now. But it's sort of hard to see exactly what he's been able to sort of focus on personally. He might be getting more information from folks he's seen who sort of walk around Washington more frequently.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And then just to point out the fact that he can glimpse out the window, but it obviously doesn't travel the way normal people travel around Washington, D.C. He also mentioned that this is a possibility for other cities around the country. We've seen it recently, National Guard troops in Southern California for those anti-ICE demonstrations. Is there concern that this deployment of National Guard widens to other different municipalities around the country?
I think that is a concern for leaders. He mentioned a couple. He mentioned Baltimore and Oakland and Chicago among the places he talked about today. Again, those are cities that aren't going to have the same sort of rules that Washington, D.C. operates under. That there isn't a provision that allows for home rule that then also allows the president to sort of take emergency powers there. But as you mentioned, we did see him deploy the National Guard in Los Angeles recently on a temporary basis. And that's certainly something that he could do even over the objections of governors from either party. So I do think that this is sort of maybe a trial balloon. I think LA was a little bit too, and now he's doing it here, and we could see it elsewhere too, depending on how things go.
All right, very good. Will Weissert, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. You're reporting there with the Associated Press. We appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. All right, great conversation. As plenty of headlines coming out of that brief